Hi, in this video I'll be making pedal boards with included patch base. All right then.
Alright, so the first thing I made was the patchbay. And for this I spent a long time thinking about what kind of enclosure I should use. I looked into making my own aluminum housing, and I even considered building one out of wood. But after going back and forth, I ended up choosing a guitar pedal enclosure. It just made the most sense. It's metal, lightweight, affordable, and it ended up fitting the project really well. The only drawback was the size. I couldn't find one that was quite big enough to fit everything, especially the power switch. So in the end, I had to mount the switch on the outside of the enclosure. It wasn't exactly what I originally pictured, but it worked. Now the first thing I did was drill all the holes for the input jacks. Once those were in place, I cut 2 squares for the power pass-through. That part was a bit tricky. I started with a jewelry saw, but I couldn't cut all 4 sides because I didn't have enough clearance. So I then cut the final side with a Dremel cutoff wheel. But after getting the openings roughed out, I went back in with a file and cleaned everything up so the edges were nice and smooth, and the fit was just right. But man, all of this took like the most precision measuring of my life, because if I was off by just a few thousandths of an inch, I wouldn't have been able to fit everything in. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a guitar pedal before, but they aren't exactly square, so it's just like, ugh. Anywho, once everything was cleaned up, I gave the enclosure a coat of black enamel spray paint. Pretty easy, and it actually turned out really well. After the paint dried, I moved on to installing all the hardware.
Went ahead and made 3. If you look, you can tell just how my soldering and cable management improved over the 3. Initially I just kind of went for it on this one, and it works, but definitely not very pretty. And then for this one I decided to make this jig here where I can take the wires, put them in the holes, and then kind of twist them around at specific lengths, and it kind of worked, but it also was just took way too much time, and it was just really hard to get all the sharp corners and whatnot. So eventually I went to just basically kind of eyeballing and doing 2 turns, and then having all the wires basically stacked on top of each other. And well, it did, in my opinion, come out with a better aesthetic. But oh man, that was a lot harder than I anticipated, just because of the lack of space, especially with the pass-through power plugs right here. Getting those wires to stay in place while I tried to solder them was a chore.
Once the patch bays were all done, I moved on to building the actual pedal boards. For the wood, I decided to use Bolivian rosewood for its rich color, and then maple for the contrast and strength. I started by using my track saw to get one edge perfectly straight, then cut all the pieces to rough width and length using the table saw. Then I book matched each board twice, cutting 3 pieces out of each board. First cutting one side, then flipping it over to cut the other. After that, I used a joiner to flatten one surface on the inner part. That way I could send all 3 through the drum sander and thickness them to 100 thousandths of an inch. The goal here was to laminate each board with 2 pieces of maple and 1 piece of Bolivian rosewood to achieve a final thickness of 300 thousandths. Doing it this way added strength and rigidity without having to make everything half an inch thick, which is what I was trying to avoid because I didn't want them feeling bulky. When it came time to glue the boards, I tried a few different methods. At first I just taped the piece together, which kind of worked, but the boards came out a little wonky once the glue dried. Then next I tried using a goat table jig to apply even pressure and keep everything flat. But that didn't work very well either, since I couldn't get the pressure consistent across all the pieces. The method that finally worked best was simply stacking the pieces and clamping them straight to my workbench. This not only gave me even clamping pressure and perfectly flat boards, but it also let me glue multiple boards at once, making it the most efficient approach overall. The only tricky part with this method was separating the boards once the glue dried. The squeeze out basically welded the pieces together along the edges, so it was a bit of a chore to get them apart. You can see here how I struggled to separate them, and at one point I even had to use a chisel to carefully pry them apart. But after separating the boards, I used my joiner sled jig to cut one side flush. Then used that side as a reference to cut 45-degree miters on each end at their final length. And this part sucked because my table saw doesn't give me the cleanest cuts, and it took multiple tries to get perfect miters. Next, I used my table saw sled to cut the angles for the sides by taping down a piece of scrap wood to use as a guide. Then once that was done, I needed to cut the front and the back faces to the proper height, but I also needed to match the angle of the sides. To do this, I taped them together the same way I would tape them to glue them up, and marked where I needed to make the cut. Then set my table saw blade to the exact same angle and crept up to the line using the joiner sled jig.
Okay, so finding this angle right here to try to match and cut these at the same exact angle as this slope here was really tricky. So before I changed the angle on my table saw, I went ahead and cut all the pieces that will go here and here on the inside like that. Went ahead and cut this angle right there. That way it matches and goes flush here, and then eventually it'll go flush right there, like that.
Now before gluing the four sides together, I went ahead and cut out the hole for the patch bay. I started by drilling a series of holes to outline the rough shape, then used a jigsaw to remove the bulk of the material. After that, I used a template that I made to route out the hole. Next, I glued the sides together, which was pretty straightforward. I started by taping 3 sides in place, then added glue to the fourth side and used more tape to hold everything together. I used my workbench to make sure the bottom stayed perfectly flush. And because I was careful to cut the miters as precisely as possible, the box came out perfectly square once the glue dried. Originally, I planned to cover all the maple with the rosewood on the outside, but once I actually saw how it looked, I really liked the contrast between the two woods. What I didn't love though was the laminated look. So instead, I decided to embrace the maple and add a trim that highlighted it, giving the border a clean, intentional appearance, kind of like the binding on a guitar. To make the trim, I cut strips and glued pieces of rosewood and maple together, almost like I was making a mini cutting board. Then once the glue dried, I ran them through my thickness sander to bring them to its final thickness. And I did this after I glued them because it's easier to get a consistent thickness on thicker strips of wood. Basically, the thinner the wood, the harder it is to get a consistent thickness, or at least that's been my struggle. Once I got everything to thickness, I then cut them into strips using my joiner jig. And I used this jig because it was safe and easy to get clean, consistent results. I also made some straight up edge banding using the maple. I started by cutting strips about 50 thousandths of an inch thick, then carefully split them in half with an X-Acto blade to create less wide strips, which this will act as basically my purfling that you'll be able to see from the side. For the next part, I used a table saw blade designed for cutting guitar fret slots. It's extremely thin, about 20 thousandths of an inch thick. And I used it to cut 2 fine lines on the front face of the pedal boards, purely for aesthetic purposes. Then, using the same purfling, I filled those lines to add a bit more detail to the front. Once that was done, I went back to the purfling and used the chisel to cut the miters. This part was pretty straightforward since I didn't have to be absolutely perfect. My main goal was just even coverage. After cutting everything, I glued one side at a time, carefully making sure I didn't have any gaps in the miters. Then after the glue dried, I sanded everything flush. And at first, I was worried that using a power sander would roll over the edges, so I did all of this by hand, which in hindsight wasn't the best idea because eventually I did pull out the power sander and I actually got a better result from it. But it all worked in the end. The next part of the binding or edge trim was much trickier because there was virtually no room for error. And figuring out exactly where to place the miters was tough. I needed the maple and rosewood to line up perfectly, and they also had to be centered. So even the smallest misalignment could make one of the pieces too thin once I flush trimmed them. Cutting the 4 miters ended up taking almost an entire extra day because I had to go incredibly slow and precise. If I were doing this again, this is the part I would do differently because it just took way too long. But in the end, it all came together and I achieved the look I was aiming for. Once that was done, I moved on to gluing into horizontal pieces where the pedals will actually rest. Looking back, if I had a more solid plan going in, I probably wouldn't have chosen this method either. But because my original aesthetic plans had changed, it kind of turned into a making it up as you go kind of situation, which is never recommended when it comes to woodworking. So what I ended up doing was squaring up one side of the board first, then setting it in place and marking exactly where I needed to make the cut. Then I cut just barely outside that line and slowly crept up on the fit until it was perfect. And I had to be extra careful here because if I cut it too short, that was it. I'd have to start over, and starting over really wasn't a great option since each one of these boards was laminated, and rebuilding one would have meant redoing a lot of work. And honestly, I just wasn't interested in doing that again, so yeah, failure was not an option. Anyways, here I'm gluing everything up, and this part was actually pretty easy because I had everything cut to such a tight fit, the pieces basically dropped into place and held themselves there. The clamps were really just there to keep everything from moving and to close up any small gaps. Now the 2 center boards were also easy to install, but there was one issue. They were only being held by an end grain to face grain glue joint, which isn't strong enough to support my hopes and dreams. So after everything dried, I went back and added some bracing underneath. That way, I could be more confident the whole thing was strong enough to handle someone aggressively stomping on it. To make the bracing, I started with a simple square stick of maple, then cut them to length using my table saw sled. Then I wanted them to have a nice bevel for a clean look, so I grabbed my hand plane and planed off one corner until they kind of had the shape of the Superman logo. Then I also needed to bevel 2 ends, and for that I used some 80 grit sandpaper along with a chisel sharpening honing guide to make sure all the angles stayed consistent. It was a bit of a fiddly process, but it got the job done and looks way nicer than just plain square blocks. And gluing all this up was pretty straightforward. I just used some cam clamps to hold everything in place. Then, for the 2 longer pedal boards, I added a center brace for extra support, but I made this one out of rosewood so it wouldn't so it would blend in a bit and not pop when you looked at it from the outside. And here I'm just using the belt sander to add some bevels to it and make everything look less blocky. Basically turning my meh rectangle into something that looks more intentional. And you can see it here. I also added corner supports, mostly for strength, but I also needed more surface area for the, spoiler alert, the rubber feet that will go on in the end. The next step was making the cover for the patch base. I really needed this piece to be thin but strong, so I decided to laminate it with carbon fiber. Now, I've never done this before, and I couldn't really find a ton of solid instructions on how to do it properly, so I kind of just winged it. Basically just slapped it on there, flooded it with epoxy, and hoped for the best. But let me know in the comments what I did wrong here, because even though it did work as intended structurally, it didn't come out as clean as I would have liked. I had a few spots where I sanded into the carbon fiber and ended up with a few small gaps here and there. It really only worked because I was able to cut around them and all of this will be hidden. But I know there's probably a better way to do this, so please, let me know.
Alright, so this is now cured for a solid week. No idea how this is going to turn out. Definitely kind of worried that, I don't know, I might have some sort of bubbles in here, but anyways, let's see what we got. Okay. Okay. Yeah, might not be too bad. Over the week I had something fall over and it spilt the resin bottle over and it leaked all over my desk. So there's a little bit of uncured resin on here, but that's just from spillage. Looks like it might have turned out all right. Need a little bit of cleanup. And I'm definitely gonna have to cut these and trim them. But all right, let's see what it looks like after it's cleaned up.
Once everything had cured, I trimmed it down on the bandsaw and then cut it to its final dimensions using the table saw and brought it to its final thickness using the drum sander. Then, using a template I made, I cut out the hole for the patch bay with the router and squared up the hole for the pass-through power inlet with a file. Then with the patch bay screwed to the faceplate, I superglued it to the front of the pedalboard and made sure to get it in place quickly, then removed the patch bay so I didn't accidentally glue the whole thing permanently. Finally, I added decorative nails to the four corners for looks and for added strength because I have trust issues with superglue. To do this, I put the board on my jointer and used a scrap piece of acrylic as a buffer to hammer the nails in without marring the surface. For the finish, I decided to keep things as simple as possible and went with Rubio Monocoat. It's a little spendy, but this is literally the easiest finish I have ever worked with that gives me a great result every time. For the color, I went with Pure because I wanted to preserve the natural look of the wood as much as possible. Then after that, I added all the hardware and that was basically it. Thanks for watching. If you're watching this at the time of posting, these will be for sale on my website at ncmguitars.com. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe. Also, do me a favor and share this with your guitar playing friends. And I'm also on all the social media things. Links will be in the description. Anyways, enjoy your shoes.